Good afternoon, everyone. First talk after lunch, so I hope I can keep you awake. So the title of my talk is The Role of Wetland Restoration in Retaining Coastal Carbon. So I suppose one question is, for wetland restoration, how do we maximize the carbon sink capacity of wetland restoration projects? And in order to address this, we need to understand what makes coastal wetlands so efficient at retaining carbon. So this is a diagram that shows a generalized carbon flow through salt marshes. And it's estimated that on a global scale, 97 teragrams of carbon enter salt marshes every year through gross primary productivity. So the production of wetland plants primarily, but also algae. Of that gross primary production, an estimated 21% is emitted back to the atmosphere through respiration, both plant respiration and through microbial decomposition as carbon dioxide. A lower percentage, like less than 1%, as methane. This percentage likely increases in fresher water wetlands. A relatively large proportion of the gross primary production is estimated to be transported laterally, exported laterally, almost 60%. Some as particulate organic carbon through processes like erosion, but also dissolved inorganic and organic carbon. What's left is what we care about when we think about wetlands as carbon sinks, is buried in the soil, an estimated 22% of that GPP. There's some uncertainties with this, but that's the flux in the process that we're focused on when we think about using wetland restoration as a carbon sink. So what makes wetlands so efficient at accumulating carbon? Well, the plants are highly productive. They produce a lot of below ground biomass in the form of roots and rhizomes. So that's a direct input of soil organic matter. And the organic matter in the soil in wetlands decomposes slowly. It's anaerobic decomposition. But unlike terrestrial ecosystems, coastal wetlands have the capacity to expand their soil volume over time. And it's a process that's illustrated by this diagram here, where when marshes flood with tidal water, there's the opportunity for sediments to deposit on the surface, and that bumps up the elevation, but also creates conditions that are conducive for plant productivity, particularly the growth of roots and rhizomes. The plant roots and rhizomes contribute to vertical accretion through the accumulation of organic matter, and ultimately this increases the soil volume and can bump up the elevation of the marsh. So this accretion process, along with other processes, particularly important in deltaic systems, of lateral expansion through progradation, both of those processes, accretion and progradation, allow the capacity to store soil carbon to increase over time. So global averaged rates of carbon burial are quite high in salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. That's why we're here. And higher than that of temperate systems and terrestrial systems. On average, salt marshes and mangroves accumulate carbon in their soil at a rate of about 200 grams of carbon per meter square per year. And this carbon burial rates on the y-axis are actually on a log scale. So if we look at the error, we can see, particularly for salt marshes, there's quite a lot of spatial variation. So in some marshes, there's been reported carbon accumulation rates, 20 grams of carbon per meter square per year, and others over 1,500. So one of the questions is, for us when thinking about restoration and how to plan wetland restoration to maximize carbon accumulation rates, is what's causing this really high variability, spatial variability in carbon accumulation rates. Well, one thing is sea level rise. And it's been shown by this really sort of neat study where they compiled carbon accumulation rates in coastal areas across the United States. And as you can see, the mean carbon accumulation rates, so the average for each of these locales and watersheds, increases as the rate of mean relative sea level rise increases. So we can see some of the highest rates of carbon accumulation occurring in areas where we have the highest rates of relative sea level rise happens to be where we're sitting today in coastal Louisiana, some of these locations. What isn't shown in this figure is the tipping point beyond which where rates of sea level rise are too high for marshes to keep pace, and plant productivity, carbon sequestration sort of plummets as the system converts to open water. But these are averages based on a number of cores in each region. When we look at the individual core data, we can see that, that even regionally and locally, there's a high amount of variability in the carbon accumulation rates. And so again, we're interested in what factors influence this local scale variability so that we can better plan restoration projects. So potential sources of local scale variability include geomorphic setting, so the amount of sediment that's available for burial of soil carbon. The elevation plays a key role in terms of the flooding dynamics, having sort of this optimized level of flooding to promote plant productivity and also allow sediments to accumulate. In a soil core where carbon is accumulating, some of that carbon may also be from allochthonous sources, not just in situ plant production. And so thinking especially in deltaic environments, the allochthonous sources of allochthonous sources of carbon coming in from the watershed are also likely very important and influencing some spatial variability in carbon accumulation rates. There also may be some differences in the preservation of soil carbon depending upon the local conditions of the wetlands. And this is an area that I've been working on. And so I'm going to share some of the research that I've done and its relevance to wetland restoration. So in a very simplistic way, we can think of the carbon that's accumulating in the soil as either being easily decomposed or made up of labile compounds or more refractory or recalcitrant carbon. So the labile compounds are things like polysaccharides, proteins, carbohydrates that are easily decomposed, most of which is considered to be oxidized, but some of which can be preserved in wetland soil, particularly because wetlands are anaerobic, and so there's a lack of oxygen. This can slow decomposition and allow for some preservation of labile carbon. And there are also interesting interactions with mineral sediments. So for example, some of the labile carbon can be incorporated into aggregates or sorbed on the surface of clay particles or mineral particles. And this can serve to protect that labile carbon and make it a little bit more difficult to access for microbes. But the majority of carbon that is considered sort of sequestered over the long term is refractory, and that is made up of compounds like lignin, humic acid, cellulose, complex compounds that are more difficult for microbes to decompose. And so, sorry. Nope. Don't. Okay, so we developed a hypothesis that marshes receiving high amounts of mineral sediment, such as deltas, have greater total labile plus recalcitrant carbon burial rates than marshes that have lower mineral sediment availability. And that's due to two processes. The first is faster transport to anaerobic depths, and secondly, greater mineral particle interactions. And these figures here sort of illustrate our hypotheses. So we tested this, not in a delta, but in two estuaries in the mid-Atlantic, the Delaware estuary, which is more mineral rich, and Barnegat Bay just to the north, that is a coastal lagoon, more mineral poor. The Delaware estuary also has a higher tidal range than the coastal lagoon, than Barnegat Bay. But importantly, both of these estuaries are experiencing similar rates of relative sea level rise. So at each of these sites, we collected a lot of soil cores and we analyzed them for total organic carbon. We fractionated the carbon into labile and refractory components. And we also did some cesium-137 dating to gather accretion rates. And we determined the mineral sediment accumulation along with the organic fraction accumulation. So these are the data for each of the cores that we collected. So this shows the organic carbon accumulation rate with the refractory fraction in gray and the labile fraction in yellow. And we have the mineral poor Barnegat Bay to the left and the Delaware Bay mineral rich marshes to the right. And one of the things that you can see is that the refractory carbon accumulation rate is relatively uniform across all of these sites, averaging 78 plus or minus 2, so a pretty tight error there, grams per meter square per year. The labile carbon accumulation rate was quite variable, ranged from about 30 to 250 grams of carbon per meter square per year. And as you can see from the individual core data, tends to be driving greater total carbon accumulation rates in the mineral-rich system. And we tested sort of the influence of mineral sediment accumulation on the carbon accumulation rate directly. And here you can see that the total organic carbon accumulation rates are shown in orange, the labile carbon in green, and the refractory carbon in blue. The refractory carbon is pretty uniform across really large range of mineral sediment accumulations, from less than 50 grams per meter square per year to over 3,000 grams of mineral sediment. But the labile carbon tended to increase over that range, and so did the total organic carbon. So this suggests, if it holds true in other locations, that we can come up with some strategies for increasing the total carbon preservation in restoration sites by planting them in mineral-rich environments. So, so the sort of take-home message is, let's try to strategize our restoration planning to restore marshes where there's a lot of mineral sediment available, if our goal is to increase carbon sequestration. And that brings us to the Mississippi River Delta, where there's lots of wetland restoration projects going on. The Mississippi River has contributed to an expansive expanse of coastal wetland area that represents about 40% of the wetland area in the lower 48. And so the river is directly and indirectly responsible for all the coastal wetlands that occur in coastal Louisiana. But similar to many deltas around the world, there's been a lot of human activities and human impacts to the system. Primarily, the lower half of the Mississippi River has been leveed and the channel has been cut off from the surrounding marshes. And so that has essentially halted the delta switching process and halted the progradation process in most areas of the coast. There's also been a lot of subsurface fluid extraction, so oil and gas extraction, and construction of canals and navigation channels has also impacted the area. This is an older map, but it illustrates in red the area of land that has been lost between 1932 and 2000. And, you know, this area has only expanded since then. So this is what, you know, an aerial image of what this looks like in some locations where we have fragmented marsh landscape that is subsiding and converting to open water, and a nice canal that's cut through the forefront of the picture. So this area is ripe for restoration. And there is a plan. So Louisiana has a 50-year restoration plan. And there's two main restoration strategies. The first is sediment diversions, one of which is shown in the star area, the Mid-Barataria Bay sediment diversion. And the idea is to basically cut a hole through the levee of the Mississippi River and allow the river and water and sediment to flow into deteriorating wetland basins. And the area of influence here is illustrated, of this particular diversion, is illustrated in brown. The other restoration strategy is marsh creation through dredge sediment placement. And on a cost basis, here's all the restoration plans. These are risk reduction, structural plans, protection plans. But on a cost basis, marsh creation is by far the most expensive. So it's important for us to know how these marshes are functioning if we're investing so heavily in them. And so my focus has been on the value of these systems in terms of carbon sequestration. So this is a typical dredge sediment marsh creation project where Nearby bay sediments, bay bottom sediments or river bottom sediments, depending on the location, are hydraulically pumped into an area of open water that was historically marsh. And typically in Louisiana, the plants are allowed to colonize naturally. Historically, they did plant, but there's a tremendous seed source, propagule source, and the marshes tend to colonize naturally pretty quickly. And so this is how this successional trajectory looks. You know, the year of marsh creation, you start to have some individual clones of Spartina alterniflora, if you're familiar. Within 5 years, the marshes typically are completely covered with vegetation. After about a few decades, the individual plant community composition is influenced mostly by the elevation of the marsh, so it shifts over time. The below ground processes take longer, and so here's a picture of dredge sediment, and then over time, ideally, we have the accumulation of peat and organic material, essentially organic carbon, at rates that are similar to natural marshes or even exceed natural marshes. So we wanted to test this in some created marshes in Louisiana. And so here we have some natural marshes in the Mississippi Deltaic region in this sort of interdistributary basin, transgressive marshes. So we have cores collected in freshwater marshes, brackish, and salt marshes. The created marshes we chose were located in western Louisiana in the Cheniere Plain, and that's because this is a hotspot for marsh creation, and there's a really nice chronosequence of created marshes from marshes that were recently constructed to ones that are decades old. We also looked at natural reference marshes essentially right next to these created marshes. So this shows the sort of peat accumulation over time in the created marshes. And, you know, looking at these pictures, the first thing that's sort of striking is, you know, after 13 years, you have a couple inches of peat. And then after 32 years, about 4 inches. Sorry, I'm using inches, but I don't know why. But anyway, so, you know, as compared to a natural marsh that has been around for hundreds of years, if not close to 1,000 years in this location, it takes a long time to accumulate this carbon. And so one of the sort of take-home messages is if we're going to use sort of dredge material, we may want to prioritize protecting this very rich carbon store, carbon sink in natural marshes, rather than starting from scratch and creating a new created wetland that has to accumulate a lot of carbon. So we may use the augmentation process, like thin layer sediment deposition, to protect these vulnerable natural marshes. I can also sort of turn your attention to this peat depth. And so we can see that over time, the depth of the peat increases, but that it's not completely related to marsh age. So the rate of peat accumulation, which sort of approximates carbon accumulation, is also related to other factors than marsh age, so environmental conditions. So this sort of summarizes the data that we collected with the carbon accumulation rate on the x-axis, the delta plain marshes showing the natural carbon accumulation rates, and there's quite a wide range. And then the natural marshes of the Cheniere Plain, which tend to have carbon accumulation rates slightly less than that of the Deltaic Plain. But on average, the natural marshes have carbon accumulation rates of 115 grams per meter square per year, which is within the range of what is typical, but it's sort of on the low end of the range. But most importantly, what we're finding is that the created marshes, even ones right next to this natural marsh, are accumulating carbon at rates that are about 50% of that which is natural. So the question is why they're not accumulating carbon at similar rates. And I don't know, but one possibility is that many of the marshes that are created in Louisiana, over 90%, are surrounded by containment dikes. These containment dikes are necessary because much of the sediment that's hydraulically pumped in is very fine-grained sand, silts and fine-grained silts and clays, and would easily, you know, sort of disperse out of the area. So they're needed for the settlement of this material to create this land. And typically after a year or so, they're gapped, and they're sort of arbitrarily gapped in terms of how many gaps they're put in, where they're put in. But given the low carbon accumulation rates in these systems, it may be that the gapping isn't enough, that these marshes aren't flooding enough, and they're not having enough sediment that's depositing. From our data, the highest rates of carbon accumulation in these created marshes were in areas where there was high density species. So if you're familiar, Distichylus spicata and Spartina patens, you can tell there's really high stem densities, very sort of thick mats, as compared to low density Spartina alterniflora. So this is an indication that these marshes are dependent on the organic matter that's being produced by these high density species. And also there's likely a secondary effect, came out as significant in our models, where these high density plants are facilitating the deposition of mineral sediment as compared to a lower density plants. So created marshes in the system are not accumulating carbon at rates similar to natural marshes. So that may sort of lead to the idea that we might have greater carbon accumulation potential if we use the natural river delta building processes. So this would be the case for a large-scale sediment diversion, like what is planned in the restoration plan, but also there might be some smaller scale activities that we can do to sort of harness this, this process. And so this shows an area that should be prograding, but is transgressing for many reasons. So this is the lower Mississippi River Delta, also known as the Bird's Foot Delta. This is an incredibly important area because it's a main navigation channel. I think $100 million worth of transport of goods every year goes through this main Southwest Pass. This area also is home to over, I'm remembering my statistics, like half a million waterfowl every year are found in these marshes. So incredibly important for wildlife and fisheries, recreation. A lot of people go fishing here, an important area. However, it is quickly losing ground, like most of Louisiana, and the marshes are converting to open water. And so managers in this area can use only a couple different strategies for wetland restoration. And one of those is to make crevasses. And essentially a crevasse is a natural delta process where a channel is cut through marshes to create a new sort of subdelta, smaller subdelta. And so here's a zoomed in area of the Bird's Foot Delta. And in this area, you can see a lot of open water, some nice marsh vegetation along the channel edges, but interior open water. And if you just keep your eyes focused right here, that area. So the Fish and Wildlife Service created this crevasse, a man-made crevasse, and that has constructed a lot of wetland area over the 12-year period. So I can sort of flash back and forth. So there's lots of open water, building lots of wetlands. So this is sort of a restoration strategy likely to not only create habitat, increase marsh area, but also sequester quite a bit of carbon. Another technique, I guess I could say, for building land in this lower part of a river delta could be a tool to create wetlands and increase carbon sequestration, but it's the use of beneficial use or dredge spoil marshes. And so each one of these boxes has been deposited as dredge sediment through the maintenance dredging of the ship channels. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers doesn't want to consider this wetland creation or wetland restoration because really they're just looking to get rid of the sediment. But there is potential of working with the Army Corps to try to maximize some of the functions that we're interested in, including carbon sequestration. So I will wrap up there and say that building land through delta restoration can increase the carbon storage capacity. We can use river delta processes such as natural flooding and sedimentation regimes to increase the carbon accumulation in the soil. Ideally, we place restoration projects in areas with high mineral sediment availability to preserve the maximum amount of soil carbon. We should use the dredge sediment to protect existing natural marshes that already have very rich carbon stores in the soil. And if we're going to create marshes, we want to make sure that there's a high degree of connectivity to increase the carbon sequestration. And of course, by expanding sort of these blue carbon habitats, we also have other benefits to the system, including an increase in wildlife and fisheries habitat, recreation, storm protection, navigation, and all of the other functions that we value from coastal wetlands.